Hey, folks, welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. Joining us today is Dr. Eric Story, a historian in residence at Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University in London, Ontario, in Canada, and adjunct professor at Wilfred Laurier University. Dr. Story reached out with tonight's topic of discussion, which is not a military battle, but a battle nonetheless. The struggle Canadian Great War disabled veterans faced in recognition, rights, and assistance after the guns had fallen silent. It has long been a desire of mine to discuss other non-military Great War topics here on the BFWWP, such as life in the occupied areas of France and Belgium, and the lives of post-war veterans. These were struggles too, and these struggles shaped the lives of everyone who went through these quiet battles, as well as the lives of their loved ones. So I was very excited when Dr. Story approached me with this idea, and I was all for it. From the Western University website, here's just a little bit more about Dr. Story. Eric Story is a historian of medicine, disability, colonialism, and war in modern Canada. He has written several articles on the legacies of the First World War and is currently developing a manuscript on the history of tuberculosis illness in early 20th century Canada with McGill Queen's University Press. His article, The Indigenous Casualties of War, 2021, won the Canadian Historical Review's Best Article Prize. And before his appointment at Western, he was an AMS postdoctoral fellow at Brock University, 2024. He completed his PhD in medical history at Wilfred Laurier University, 2024. So, Dr. Story joins us this evening to discuss the issues of disabled Canadian Great War veterans, the issues that they faced after their return home from the battlefields. Dr. Story, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Mike, thanks for having me on. I'm glad we were able to find a time to finally meet.
Yeah, a few hiccups along the way, but that's just life, and we just roll with it. um, all right. So while it may seem like I've just said a lot about you, I would like to actually hear a little bit more about yourself. Did your interest in did your interest in medical history begin your interest in the First World War, or was it through some other entry point?
Yeah, it really was through the First World War, Mike. I had, wonderful professors throughout my undergraduate tenure at the University of Saskatchewan,
Okay.
and there were a number of courses on military history, but specifically the First World War really resonated with me. I took a seminar course, and I remember just being asked by that professor who led that course, at the end of the class, what is missing in the history of the First World War in Canada? What individuals, what stories are not being told? And I thought disabled veterans were a story very much missing in the narrative of Canada's First World War. And that sort of launched me on, a trajectory looking at, the memory of the First World War, looking at disabled Indigenous veterans during my master's degree. And it was in there that I really saw how badly tuberculosis was impacting uh, Indigenous veterans specifically, much, much higher rates, disproportionately high rates. And it was really from there that laid the seed for my larger project, this book manuscript that you referred to on tuberculosis. That was kind of the beginnings of it, was finding these disproportionately high rates of tuberculosis amongst Indigenous communities. And so that's sort of the work I'm doing now, is looking at tuberculosis both as an illness, an acute illness that people are experiencing in hospital, taking treatment, but
Mhm.
also how they're navigating chronic illness over, their lifetimes. And this is where, disability really comes to the fore.
Just to go like a little bit off topic here, this tuberculosis, is this just net like the naturally occurring tuberculosis that we are now immunized against to a large degree, or is it like I've heard of like gas related tuberculosis?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's actually a bit of a myth that gas caused tuberculosis.
Okay, okay.
It's an interesting part of it, and soldiers of the First World War and even civilians very
Hmm.
much believed that gas caused tuberculosis. And I haven't quite tracked this kind of theme down quite yet, but I've noticed in a lot of pension files of disabled veterans at large, when they die of tuberculosis, oftentimes family members are writing in obituaries, or they're even writing on their gravestones or at their funerals that gas was the culprit for their deaths. But
Interesting.
once you go into their service files, what's really interesting is that a lot of them actually have absolutely no exposure to gas throughout the war. Nonetheless, family members are attributing gas to their deaths after the war. So, in the medical literature, after the war, doctors very much come to the conclusion that gas is not causing tuberculosis. It's caused by an infectious agent, a bacteria that is often expelled through coughing,
Mhm.
spitting, even breathing, and eventually is inhaled by a victim and can, but not necessarily, will manifest into an open case of disease.
Okay.
So, the environment of the First World War may or may not have, again, it's not exactly clear, left men susceptible to becoming infected with tuberculosis and
Right.
living close quarters with other soldiers who also may have been infected, may have led them to being susceptible to falling ill.
Hmm.
But yeah, there is a bit of a myth. There's not there's no causative kind of link between gas and tuberculosis. And so what is probably happening for these men is that they are infected before they get into the ranks of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. And this
Okay.
wouldn't just be Canadian soldiers. This would be, all soldiers who enlisted in any fighting force during the First World War
Right.
probably came in already infected with it, because you can live with tuberculosis bacteria in your body your entire life without actually manifesting symptoms. And once they got into the ranks and started to, be exposed to the weather, exposed to the environment, the stress of, fighting a war, that's often when their bodies would break down and start to develop open symptoms of TB.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. My God. It's funny now I'm like, gas related tuberculosis. Like why would you even why didn't you question that a little bit more? But yeah, well, oh, interesting. Thank you for that. Um
Mhm.
so this like I said in the beginning, I'm so glad you reached out with this idea for a discussion because I always think of, what happens to the characters in the movie, like after the film credits stop.
Yeah.
Like how does life go on afterwards, after the hero returns home and everything. And so this is a great topic because like, the 1920s, like these veterans, like they are, yes, they're the returning heroes, but how long does that last? So I'd like to start with a broad view of tonight's
Mhm.
topic. So, when a Canadian soldier suffered, a catastrophic injury, like losing a limb, like, um, what was the process that they went through?
Yeah, so a lot in Army life for soldiers is waiting,
Mhm.
waiting and waiting and waiting, and that was the case when soldiers were wounded to a point where they were no longer viable as manpower and were needing to be evacuated from the battlefield, and eventually discharged home. So, once a soldier was wounded or became ill or suffered some injury, they would be often transported to a field ambulance station or a casualty clearing center. Eventually, they would make their way to a hospital, often on the coastline in France. And it was from there the doctors would have to make a decision. Was this soldier able to recover here and eventually make their way back to the front lines, or were they needing to be evacuated across the channel to England?
Okay.
They were quite, ill, injured, wounded. They'd move over to England, and the doctors would make the same decision there. Can we, heal this soldier to the point where we can send him back across the channel to the continent and back onto the front lines, or is this guy going to need some, serious medical attention before eventually being discharged home? Again, if this, doctors decide that he's not a viable soldier any longer,
Hmm.
they're gonna, provide the medical attention or the medical care that the soldier needs for as long as he does, and then eventually ship them back home across the Atlantic Ocean to Canada.
Okay.
So once they're back home in Canada, there's sort of these discharge depots that are set up, mostly on the eastern kind of seaboard, but some a bit more towards the interior at Quebec City. And it's here basically where soldiers are effectively transformed from military personnel
Hmm.
to civilians. And the medical board is basically making a decision of, is this guy, deserving of a pension? Is he requiring further medical care at a military hospital or a more specialized hospital like a tuberculosis sanatorium?
Hmm.
Or is he simply just going to be discharged home? And that's kind of where soldiers are left after they have finished going through the discharge depots and the medical board have made their decisions. Soldiers are discharged into the care of, other medical personnel, or they're discharged into their, hands of their families, friends, with often a uniform and a little bit of discharge pay.
Okay. Okay. So what is the world that disabled Canadian veterans return to in Canada? And, again, thinking of life after the film credits have ended,
Yeah.
what is like the employment environment for them after the armistice and, after all the victory parades end? And um, what 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 did these men face like realistically for, hey, I'm home and I'm, missing a leg. What
Yes.
do I do now? Like,
Yeah. So I think we often think when we're thinking about the post First World War period, we think of the Roaring Twenties, right?
mhm,
As this period of, great economic riches, of, parties, and, you're looking at the kind of first wave feminist movement achieving major successes, receiving suffrage. And so kind of envision this sort of very wonderful, peachy, economically roaring condition of the 1920s. And again, that's a bit of a myth, especially when we look in Canada. Immediately after the war, it actually looks a lot like the conditions we're looking at today in the 2020s, right? You have a pandemic that goes on right at the end of the war, Spanish flu. You have inflation starting to tick up, which really starts to bite hard in kind of late 1919, early 1920. You have unemployment rising in the early 1920s because an economic recession hits not just Canada, but it hits the world as well.
right.
Caused in no small part because of tariffs that were levied by an American administration in the 1920s. So there's a lot of kind of resonances, right, between present day 2026 and post First World War, not only Canada but the world as well. So it's a very discombobulating period. You also have in Canada one of the the largest strike in Canadian history in Winnipeg, the Winnipeg General Strike.
Okay.
So it's a very sort of discombobulating, turbulent period. But nonetheless, veterans come out of the war with expectations. They
Hmm.
have expectations that their government is going to take care of them because they have made promises that, especially those who were wounded on the battlefields, that the government had an obligation to care for them. And they also had expectations that Canada was going to be a better place than it was before the war. That was very much what the war was fought for. That was what the mythology that sort of, was created about the war, which
Hmm.
permeated well beyond the wartime years, is that there was a purpose that this war was fought for. And if we were going to realize that purpose, Canada needed to be a better place. And so for veterans, especially disabled veterans, they were expecting care and they were expecting an optimistic future. And for many disabled veterans, especially those with, serious disabilities, those with amputations, those suffering from tuberculosis, for example,
Hmm.
they encountered some serious struggles after the war, not only related to employment, but just around general prejudice around people with disabilities.
How does it like so, like this is I get that it happens, but it's just like fascinating in I guess in a morbid way. But like, 1918, the hero returns, and or maybe he came home in 1917, missing an arm or a leg, and he's a
Yeah.
hero. But then you get into the 1920s, and there's now prejudice against any Canadian veteran, and like what is like why? why that shift? Like why that shift? Is it like these guys were, suddenly like, thanks for your service, but like, please don't bother me with too many things. You make me uncomfortable. Especially if like visibly wounded. Like why the prejudice?
Well, I think there's kind of two things that are going on at once, right?
Hmm.
I think first of all, again, with this expectation that government is going to take care of them, that's a very new expectation. Civilians before that had a very limited idea of government, and government officials too expected that they would have very limited intervention in the lives of those of Canadian citizens at large,
Okay.
right? And so the idea is that the state is thinking, yes, we have an obligation to veterans, but we want to make sure that this intervention that we're providing, these services, medical services, pensions, other supports, they should be limited and they need to encourage self-sufficiency.
Right.
And
Right.
this gets into ideas of what it means to be a man, being self-sufficient, providing for one's family. It's very much bound up in ideals of masculinity, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so that's where, especially once you hit kind of the mid 1920s, even before then, really 1923, government really starts to pull back in
Oh,
terms of the supports that it's providing. There's a vocational training program that was created in 1917 with the idea that there would be limited job training for disabled veterans
okay.
that would provide them with the support and the training they need to then transition into a new career post-war. But once that job training was done, government's done,
Yeah.
right? That's all they need to do. The only thing that they were willing to provide long term was pensions,
Okay.
right? So that's kind of factor number one is government was willing to provide care and they understood they had an obligation, but they also wanted that obligation to be limited,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Now, factor number two is just long-standing kind of prejudicial attitudes towards disabilities or people with disabilities, I should say, that had a role to play here. So once you start hitting into like the mid 19th century in Canada, it happens a bit earlier in the United States, but mid 19th century onwards, Canada starts to industrialize. A lot of urban centers start to develop, these industrial factories, so on and so forth. And it's during this period that people with disabilities who very much did have a purpose
Hmm.
when they were working on the individual family farm, families would find ways to, give them work and very much incorporate them meaningfully into the family economy. Once the economy starts to shift away from the hands of individual families and into these kind of large scale industrial factories, disabled people at large they're seen as unproductive. They're seen as a liability to employers because they're seen as clumsy. They are seen as, again, potential liabilities that could either slow down the productivity of the various industries they're working in,
Hmm.
or they may become injured themselves, which then may put the employer on the hook for workman's compensation.
Right.
Um, but then there's also the potential of being a hazard to other workers as well. And so these sort of attitudes that really start to kind of form very strongly by the turn of the 20th century, they continue until, obviously we hit the post First World War period. And so this is kind of the environment, the cultural environment that disabled veterans are living in. Is government has a limited obligation for their care and for their ongoing support. And secondly, those with visible disabilities in particular are experiencing job discrimination, which means that they're finding it much more difficult to find their feet and to successfully transition into the civilian world.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. You bring up a good point that I've read somewhere along the line that like in Britain, most people up until around the First World War, like most people had very little interaction with their government. Like I believe like you didn't need to have a passport at the time, and interaction with your government was basically your postman and your local police officer. And then everything starts to change after that, and yeah, such a war of such effort and scale. These men are, yeah, the government's going to have to start looking at like, hey, we asked these guys to, basically like sacrifice their bodies. Like we're obligated to take care of them. But of course, like, yeah, they definitely want to put limits on it. And as the economy probably slumped ever more in the 20s, immediate post-war, they probably also at the same time they want to pull back on those services because it's expensive. So, man. Um, so to prepare for our talk, you sent me a newspaper article you wrote about two gentlemen named George Hincks and Marshall McDougall. How do these men capture the plight of the disabled veteran in post World War One Canada?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. George Hincks and Marshall McDougall, they are they're able to speak to a lot of the issues that disabled veterans were facing, but they themselves are actually not actually great archetypes for the disabled veteran population at large. Them being amputations or war amputees, I should say. I think, especially after the First World War, war amputees very much became the defining image of the disabled veteran. Just much like how shell-shocked veterans, once you get past the Vietnam War, very much became the archetype, the 21st century, the late 20th century and the early 20th century, 21st century archetype for the First World War soldier. After the First World War, war amputees were very much that archetype.
Okay.
But the reality is there aren't actually very many war amputees in Canada. There was somewhere between, I think, 3,000 and 4,500, depending on where you're getting your information from.
Okay.
And after the war, there were about 172,000 soldiers that were wounded or injured or in some form.
Hmm.
And in addition to that, you have 475,000 cases of illness or disease on the battlefield.
Okay.
So a very small number. So in terms of, how they represent the disabled veteran population, not very well. Those suffering from respiratory illnesses and just from like gunshot wounds and other flesh wounds actually tended to be a lot more representative of the
Okay.
disabled veteran population. Even things like arthritis or rheumatism, sort of joint pain and things like that, those veterans would probably be more representative. Nonetheless, Hincks and McDougall, they in 1923 they set out on a journey across Canada to speak to the issues that disabled veterans, specifically war amputees, were facing in the post-war era. It was a remarkable tour. They traveled over 2,500 kilometers, and I think perhaps there, in speaking to the issues that disabled veterans were facing, that's where I think their story and the things they were speaking about really do resonate beyond kind of their particular circumstances.
Wow. Did they what was the effect that their incredible journey, like, so what Dr. Story is mentioning, folks, is that these two gentlemen, both war amputees, they had each had lost a leg, and they set off literally, you know, trekking across Canada. They had a goal. They did not make the goal. They both had to stop short, but still, like, what they were able to accomplish is really really remarkable. So did their efforts bear any lasting effects or outcomes?
Yeah, Mike, why don't I maybe just step back for a minute and just speak about the journey itself, because it is
Sure.
a remarkable one, and I think your listeners would be very interested to know more about it. So George Hincks and Marshall McDougall, as you mentioned, they were both leg amputees, so each only had one leg, and in 1923 they were both taking treatment in a military hospital, and a fellow patient who was there with them said to the entire ward of patients. He issued a challenge. Not really sure if he was being fully serious, but nonetheless, he issued a challenge. And he said, I'll bet that no man here could walk from Calgary, which is kind of north of Western Montana,
Okay.
um, could walk on crutches from Calgary to Ottawa, which is in the nation's capital, and it's about 3,000 to 3,500 kilometers away. I can't remember exactly how far it is. It's very far. I don't know the conversion to miles, so I apologize to your listeners. Maybe Mike can look that up while I'm telling the
Yeah.
story. But nonetheless, George Hincks and Marshall McDougall, they have a discussion and they say, we'll take you up. We'll take that bet. We'll show you that we can make this trek on crutches from Calgary to Ottawa. And so in early spring 1923, they depart Calgary, and they start to walk across Canada. They walk from Alberta, which is where Calgary is located, across Saskatchewan and Manitoba, two provinces across, and they end up in Winnipeg. And this is probably the most consequential stop on their tour. Along the way, Marshall McDougall would play the piano, and George Hincks would give lectures, kind of speaking to the issues that disabled veterans faced in the post-war world.
Hmm.
And this was how they financed their trip. Actually, was through the donations from people showing up to the events that they would put on.
Yeah.
And so every day they would stop off in some community and they'd play the piano and give a lecture, sleep at, a hotel or at a, friendly, friendly individual's home, and then they would take off the next day. And they eventually made it to Winnipeg, which is called the Gateway to the West, very much like Chicago and in the United States.
Okay.
And it was here that George Hincks gave perhaps his most consequential and even controversial speech. It was provocative. And basically, what he said was that the reason why disabled veterans have not found their feet in the post-war world, and specifically why war amputees have not found their feet, is because of the prejudice that arises from the visibility of disability. That was his words, the visibility of disability. And what he meant by that was that veterans who were visibly disabled to the naked eye experienced employment discrimination. Because as I mentioned to you earlier, employees saw disabled individuals as unproductive workers,
Yep.
right? They were seen as a liability and they were seen as less productive. And so that is the prejudice that George Hincks identifies in his speech. And, we often think about disability rights activism, often dating it to the civil rights era after the Second World War. But
Okay.
you can see in that speech right there that Hincks is speaking to disability rights in the early 1920s, 50 years before we often identify the disability rights movement. So that's a significant part of their journey.
Okay.
Once they leave Winnipeg, they travel to the next province over, which is Ontario, the largest province in Canada. And this is where Ottawa is located. But unfortunately, this is where their journey comes to a close. Both men are just battered and bruised. They're exhausted. They're sore. They're, suffering immense amounts of pain. And they decide to end their journey on the western shores of Lake Superior. And ultimately, that's where their journey ends. And kind of their story fades into the pages of history after that. Nobody has written about Hincks or McDougall. Nobody has remembered their tour, aside from a few family members who are interested genealogists.
Hmm.
And so that was sort of my part of writing about disabled veterans, was resurrecting their story and speaking to an early history of disability rights activism and specifically advocacy for disabled veterans.
Wow. So, folks, I did look up. So the distance from Calgary to Ottawa, it's about 3,300 kilometers. That's about 2,000 miles. And if they made it a little bit past Winnipeg, they had completed about um, at probably upwards of like 850 miles that they had completed, but before they both had to stop. So I mean, that is incredible in itself, because they were moving under their own power, and also taking a great risk in self-financing through these lectures and shows and everything. I mean that is a sort of bravery that I can very honestly say that I don't have. Like like wow.
Yeah, I know.
Um,
And just imagining, like, I think, the important thing is to remember too, these guys are on crutches. They're not using 21st century crutches. They're using early
no.
20th century crutches. So they're wooden, there's not padding, there's wrapped cloth
Yep.
that, is protecting their armpits. But at multiple points, they're stopping along the way. Their armpits are rubbed raw with open red sores, sort of festering. They're exhausted. Obviously, they've lost, a limb, and those, amputated limbs are causing them pain throughout. And then also just the state of the roads, right? There's
Right.
not paved highways. I actually just by chance encountered a fellow colleague at the archives just last week who is working on the history of highways. And I was like, no way, I had no idea what exactly highways looked like in the 1920s when I was
Right.
writing about these two guys' journey. And I asked them, I was like, so what would the highways have looked like, moving from Alberta all the way to Ontario? And he said, at best gravel, probably just dirt,
Ooh, that's
right?
tough. Yeah.
So again, like just the determination and
Hmm.
the endurance is just staggering. It's incredible.
Also incredible for for them to name the issue, the visibility of disability. Like they called it, like you said, like a half century ahead of their time. Like
Yes.
really, really incredible, really insightful. Um, so when did when did views on disabled veterans start to shift? And I that was this was my next question, along with, how are disabled veterans viewed in Canada today? And you indicated that, the civil rights era, like, and then you started to have disability rights and everything. Is that when the view of disabled veterans start to change?
It's a good question, and I don't have a great answer for you, Mike, on that specific question.
Sure.
Um, the history of disabled veterans, it's a growing field, but it tends not to be written in strictly disability history forms. Um, they're often looking at sort of the struggles and experiences of being disabled as opposed to talking about, employment discrimination
Hmm.
or, ableism that is kind of limiting their ability to exist in the world. Um, so I don't have a great answer of when exactly those views start to change. It may have started to shift after the Second World War,
Okay.
but those histories have yet to be written. So I don't want to say for sure, but undoubtedly, the larger disability rights movement that really took off in the 1970s and onwards, those, that activist movement also meant that disabled veterans
Okay.
were being supported in that movement, right? But I think at the same time, as much as disability rights activism, the disability rights movement in the late 20th century is important, there are long-lasting stereotypes of disabled veterans that I mentioned, the sort of war amputee being the quintessential archetype of the
Right.
First World War veteran, which really did persist even through into the Second World War period. And it really didn't start to change until PTSD was included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders or Mental Disorders, I should say, in 1980. And
Okay.
it was really from there, the advocacy work of Vietnam War veterans, and also sort of film depictions, Saving Private Ryan being a great example, that, the psychological costs of war really started to override these previously very visible, this very focus on visibility and amputation. And so there's really been two sort of defining understandings of disabled veterans. In the earlier period, it's very much based on physical wounding and
Hmm.
amputation. And once you move into the, mid 1970s and onwards, the kind of psychologically wounded veteran has really come to dominate how contemporary audiences understand disabled veterans.
Right. Right. My gosh. I'm old enough to have watched Saving Private Ryan in the theater when it came out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, boy,
It's a great
man.
movie.
That yes, yes. But I it's interesting that you bring it up because I recall a friend of mine telling me at the time, when it was in theaters, that hotlines had been set up because the the film had awakened many dormant memories in World War II veterans at that time, and they were, they were looking for an outlet, so the film triggered a series of like hotline phone numbers that veterans could call to help, like, just unburden themselves. So
Yeah.
yeah, the those invisible wounds. So this is a bit more of a general question, more based on events today, but like listeners, most likely Canadian listeners, like how can how could listeners help veterans in Canada today? And I realize this is a very broad question.
Yeah. I think it is, getting to understand the issues that veterans are facing. I can really only speak to the Canadian context right
Sure.
now. But some of the major challenges that disabled veterans in particular are facing are extremely backlogged pension application processes. I think I read in throughout the pandemic, the backlog was starting to get fixed, but in more recent years, the backlog has gone back up. And so there are now, I think, over 11,000 cases that are currently backlogged or past the 4-month window that the government says it will take from initial application to being processed.
Hmm.
And so it really does mean advocating for more, resources being devoted to, processing these pension applications. I think it also means, pushing bureaucrats to think through more creative solutions to, streamline some of these applications, because this backlog issue is not just a Veterans Affairs problem. This is something that government, I'm in not only in Canada but across the world are
Sure.
facing in terms of backlogs. And so, whether that's leveraging artificial intelligence or, really rethinking some of these extremely onerous bureaucratic processes that were set up initially, so that these applications can move through more quickly and disabled veterans are actually able to get the support that they need, the financial support that they need. I think
Hmm.
that would be a really excellent place to start. Um, and I think it also, a big part of it is just simply being knowledgeable, right? There's been a lot of discussions around truth and reconciliation in Canada with Indigenous peoples.
Okay.
And a big part of that is just education, right? Being informed and being knowledgeable about the issues surrounding reconciliation. And so if listeners are really interested in, um, and supporting veterans, disabled veterans, but veterans more widely, it means reading up on the issues that are facing veterans in your own community. And those are going to vary by state in the United States. They're going to, in the Canadian context, they may vary by gender, they may vary by, racial or ethnic background. But it does mean being knowledgeable and being educated and reading up on the issues that are pertinent to veterans in your own community.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Thank you for that response. That was great. And a bit more personal to you is our final question here is where can listeners learn more about your work?
Yeah, so I'm not a big social media guy, Mike. I was in the past, but COVID broke my brain, and I decided that I needed to get off of social media.
Not a
Uh,
bad decision. Yeah.
Yes, so I have an account on X, I have an account on BlueSky, but you probably won't find me posting very much on there. If I post anywhere, it's on LinkedIn, so you can
Okay.
certainly follow my work on LinkedIn. But if folks ever have questions or want to drop me a line about work that they're doing on disabled veterans or have any questions, they can just reach me by email at estory@wlu.ca.
WOU.ca, you said?
WLU.ca.
WLU. Okay. WLU.ca. Perfect. Perfect. Okay. All right. All right. Well, Dr. Story, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate you reaching out and us getting to this point of shedding light on Canadian disabled veterans, and also um, hopefully sparking some of that conversation on veterans everywhere to for anybody who hears this. who listens to this episode. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me on, Mike. Like I said, it took a while for us to make this work, but I very much appreciate your patience and having me out to speak to some of my research into this area.
Perfect. Thank you.